thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion with Ade Rawcliffe. We're really so grateful and excited to have you join us today. Thank you. My name's Emily and I am an alumni fellow from Clore Social. I did the programme about 7 years ago, and now I have the joy and privilege of coordinating some Clore programmes and have been doing that for the last couple of years. So just a little bit before I hand over to Ade, because you don't want to hear from me, about the Leaders Now series. So it's a series of free events whereby we gather some fantastic speakers from across the sector, really diverse range, just to stimulate discussion, to stimulate our learning, to keep us engaged and interested and learning from each other. Carry on that discussion. We'd be really grateful if you use your social media using the tag Leaders Now, and I think my glamorous assistant Nadia is going to put that into the chat now. Thank you so much. So please keep the discussion going online, and format is that I'm going to ask Ade a few questions. We're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then I'll open it up to questions from the group, either using the Q&A function or the chat function. So please start thinking of those questions as we're discussing this morning. So Ade, thank you so much for joining us. Ade's Group Director of Diversity and Inclusion at ITV and has so many other responsibilities. I'm going to tell you a few. She's chair of BAFTA's Learning, Inclusion and Talent Committee, a board member of Women in Film and Television, founding board member of Time's Up UK, and a trustee of the National Trust. So you are a busy lady, and that makes me even more grateful for you giving us your time today. So thank you so much. I wanted to start, Ade, by just asking you a little bit about your current role, but also the journey that you've taken to get you to that place.
Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here. It's sort of just nice to talk to anyone that I'm not related to. So I'm very excited to speak with you today, Emily. So I am, as you said, Group Director of Diversity and Inclusion at ITV. And my job really is to set strategy for the business, but with accountability at board level. It's a new role. I've only been in post since September, but it's just really good to have that role at that sort of level. And one of the things I've been really struck by is how many things that we discuss as a business that intersect with diversity and inclusion, because it could be about employment practices, it could be about company restructure, this obviously could be about programming. There's lots of things that actually need to be viewed through the lens of diversity, equality and inclusion. So I think it's really great that the role is there. But it's interesting actually, because I was the first group director of diversity and inclusion in the FTSE 100, and the day I started we dropped out of the FTSE 100. so it was a mini accolade, so it happened sort of short term. And my background is that I started live in TV production. I grew up in a small town in the north of England called Macclesfield. I was one of the very few black children there, and when I was growing up I'd always sort of have old ladies come up to me and say to me things like, "Hey duck, I bet it's the first time you've ever seen the snow." And of course it wasn't, because I was growing up in Macclesfield in the 70s, which is probably one of the snowiest areas in the UK. Yeah. But it sort of was really striking even then that what representation means, because you don't see people on television, you actually don't think they exist. So it's no surprise in a weird sort of way that I ended up in the job that when I was growing up in the 70s in Macclesfield didn't exist, but it's something that's always been really close to my heart about how representation matters in terms of being on screen. And as now I work at ITV, and Trevor McDonald was such a big thing for us. Being able to watch news at 10 and see Trevor tell us the news was just like it was God telling us the news. It was such an important thing for us. So you can see how different communities in television that have been excluded or not had access, how, if you're not seeing, how you feel. And so I can sort of feel that really personally. So I worked in TV production. I sort of produced all those shows of that generation, like Big Breakfast, Big Brother, This Morning, all those sorts of shows that everybody cuts their teeth on. And eventually I ended up working at Channel 4, doing a sort of diversity and talent job, which was about sort of driving representation, particularly on screen, and particularly in those people making what was on screen. And when I first started the role, it was interesting how what you realize is that when it comes to inclusion, most people don't set out in the morning and say, who can I exclude today? What often happens is because of our experiences, we all have blind spots, which is why a diverse workforce really matters. So I would have conversations with commissioning editors and say, look, you know, you haven't cast any Black people in your show. And they'd say, well, of course I wouldn't have not done that, of course. And then they'd look back and say, oh, I haven't, I just didn't think, I'm so sorry. How can I make, you know, what can we do? So I think a lot of my work is around sort of trying to embed practices so people can't have blind spots. So I think it's about how you make this part of everybody's job, because I can't change things just by being on the board by myself. I have to empower other people in the business to work on improving representation, both within our workforce, but also on screen. And we can do that by building it into our commissioning processes, building it into our recruitment processes. You know, we have performance related pay, which has a diversity objective. So I think you can do the inspirational stuff, which is great, but I also think you need to do the harder stuff, which is about how do you embed this so it's seen as a business objective that everybody's responsible for.
Wow, gosh, I mean, that is massive. As you said, diversity and inclusion lens could be applied to so many different things, couldn't it? With that huge breadth, how do you go about working out where to begin and where to focus that immense energy that I'm just getting off the screen?
Well, we've started, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have definitely, I mean, because we are a public service broadcaster, I think a lot of our focus has initially been around on screen and how people perceive our view, perceive what they see. So it's really important for our viewers to see themselves represented. So I think we've spent a lot of focus on screen, but I think also what we're really aware of is that was sort of stage one, if you like, but what really matters is authenticity. And so then it's about who's behind the screen, so who's telling those stories and how are they telling those stories. One thing that I've been really struck by is we did a whole bit of research called Seen on Screen, and we went to our viewers and asked, you know, different viewers from different protected groups, whether it be, you know, disabled viewers, whether it be viewers from LGBTQ plus community, what they thought of our output. And what was amazing to see was the nuance with which people understand storytelling. So actually they say things like, oh, that was a British Asian family, but we know the writer wasn't British Asian because we could tell by the way the story was being told. Mm-hmm. So I think the challenge for ITV and broadcasters like us is how you authentically tell stories about people from different backgrounds, but at the heart of mainstream television. Because I think it's also about, for ITV, it's about what is it that unifies us, but we also need to be able to show our differences. So it's quite a subtle thing, because we're not trying to get people to pretend they're not Black or pretend they're not disabled. We want them to do that, but we also want it not to be the only narrative. So we want to see the complexity of their character, but we also want it to feel like it's relatable. Because I mean, lots of stories that I watch where I sort of, you know, I've just watched Unorthodox. I'm not from that community, but there are things in it that I can relate to. And I think there's a universality of specific storytelling, which is sort of what we're trying to aim at.
Yeah, gosh, so many questions pinging in my mind. I'm going to try not to ask them all because I want the audience to have a chance to ask lots of questions as well. So I'm going to move on to ask you. You've talked a little bit about the influences have shaped you and your upbringing and that comment about the snow. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about those influences that have shaped you into the leader, particularly with the kind of leadership angle, into the leader that you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of, I have a very strong mother. So I have two other sisters and I have a very, very strong mother. So my mother was always sort of would fight for us and was always sort of organising things like, you know, when I was very little, there wasn't a playgroup in my area of Macclesfield, so she set one up. So she's very sort of empowered to do things and has always encouraged us to sort of be the change we want to see. So I think that's really influenced us. But I also think that because I sort of grew up in a community, a northern white working class community where I was one of the minority of Black faces, I think that has obviously shaped me as well, so that I feel very proud to be a Northerner. I've got to be honest. I mean, that's definitely part of my identity, but I'm also sort of Nigerian as well. And I think that's the other thing that's interesting around diversity, isn't it? Is that it's the diversity of thought that we all bring with us. Because when I find it most exciting is when you have lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, but you have two black people in the room who don't necessarily agree with each other, because just because they're black, it doesn't mean they share the same perspective. And I think that's when it's exciting, when you get diversity within diversity. And I think that's where we're trying to get to. We're on a journey, we're not there yet, but that's where we're trying to get. I mean, Matthew Syed, I don't know if you've had him come and talk to you, but he's written a brilliant book, and we've been doing some work with him at ITV called Rebel Ideas. And he talks about sort of measuring creativity and how many ideas you can get. So if you have 10 people and you ask 10 people to come up with 10 ideas, say to 10 people, you know, come up with 10 ideas each, how many ideas would you expect to get? The best case scenario is you get 100, because people are different. But if you've got people that are similar from similar backgrounds, you might get ideas that overlap, so you get fewer ideas. So that's one of the things that I find really, really inspiring. But also I think in sort of leadership style, I think we have to be honest with leaders and say that actually, when you have teams that are more different, they might give you diversity of thought, but they will be more difficult to manage. And I think as leaders, we have to lean into that and say, actually, we can cope with sort of instability and managing different people to get to a better output in the end. But I think the thing we have to resist as leaders is actually employing people who are similar to us, just so that it makes it easier to manage them.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with you. So my next question, and there's a few questions popping up on the chat already, which we will get to in just a moment, but I'm just really interested in what you would do differently if you had your time again.
Oh my goodness, you know what? It's such an interesting question, because it's a sort of question that I would ask someone if I was doing what you're doing, but it's a really difficult question to answer, because I think that generally my personality is very forward looking, so I don't overdwell on the past. But in terms of looking at my career, what I notice differently to myself versus my children of the next generation is I think they're much more confident than I was. So I think when I was starting out, I wouldn't occupy space in the same way they do. And I'm really struck, even just with the response to the whole Black Lives Matter movement and all the protests that happened last year, and obviously the horrific murder of George Floyd. I mean, my husband's a school teacher, and he said that his kids were saying to him, we want the curriculum changed by Monday or we're not coming back to school. So I think probably I've been too patient for change. And when I look at the younger generation, I really admire that the urgency they feel.
Wow, yeah, gosh, that is a tall order. Thank you. And then I was just wondering about the current climate. So you mentioned Black Lives Matter, and it's obviously been a tumultuous year, 18 months. And I'm just wondering, in the current climate, what do you do to look after yourself within that challenge, but also to motivate and continue to inspire and engage those around you, when so many people are just juggling so much at the moment?
Yeah, no, I think you know, it's been an extraordinary year. Sometimes I sort of feel that I have no words left for what we've all been through, because obviously there was the pandemic that we're still living through, which sort of highlighted sort of the horrendous inequality in our society of groups that were from, you know, whether it's different ethnic groups, whether it's people from lower incomes. And so it really highlighted that. Then off the back of that, you had the George Floyd murders. Then off the back of that, you had the sort of Black Lives Matter protest. And you know what? I've got to be honest with you. I found that period really difficult. And I think it has probably been one of the most difficult periods of my professional life, because it's that whole thing. I mean, you know, I spoke to other friends, and I felt that going to work after that, I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, I'm going to be feeling really quite upset inside today, but I've got to go and do my job. And also the responsibility of feeling that you have to represent a whole community of people, and the fear of getting that wrong. And so looking back on it, it was quite a difficult, you know, I had some very difficult conversations with lots of different people and all that sort of stuff. So it was really, really difficult. And what I try to do, I don't always do it successfully, is I try to separate the job from me. And I think you have to try and do that. Even though I'm really passionate about what I do, I try to separate the job from me. And the other thing is I try really hard to stay physically healthy. I think it really matters. So I try to get up in the morning and do some exercise just to have that separation from work. But it's really difficult when you do jobs like this, because there is no separation from work. Because even if you go out the weekend, not that we ever do that anymore, and you say what you do, someone's always someone's always got an opinion on what you do. You know, you're either too woke, or you should be doing this, or you should be doing that. You know, I met my Tory MP in Sainsbury's, and she told me that, you know, we weren't doing enough on screen, and you sort of think, so so it is constant. So you do have to sort of try and separate yourself from the job, and also, you know, give yourself time. And I think you also have to be realistic about what you can achieve as well, because I think sometimes lots of people can spend their time spreading themselves too thin, and what I would rather do is have impact in fewer things, and I have to be quite strict with myself about that as well. So that those are the things that I do.
Very admirable. I'm interested, like, particularly at the moment when we are living and working in the same spaces most of the time. How do you manage to? Have you got any advice on how you manage that separation? Because clearly it's a role you're so passionate about. How do you achieve that?
Well, if I have to do things like this, so because obviously in our house the fight for the Wi-Fi is just insane, because everyone's struggling with Wi-Fi, so I have to sort of take the leads of everything my teenage kids have got to make sure that I have all the Wi-Fi. So there's that, what I would say is that I'm finding this with everybody. I think that because we're sort of stuck in this screen in this weird world, I think that we are all working longer hours, because the temptation to just do another extra hour. Just. So I think we have to be really aware of that. And one of the things that I'm trying to do as a leader is not give people stuff. Is sometimes my worst. So when I used to work in commissioning at Channel 4, one of the things that I loved doing was clearing my inbox on a Friday. So I would love to clear my inbox on a Friday. And so all the rejections and everything, so that I would start with a clear desk on a Monday. Someone just said, one of my line managers took me on side and said, well, why did you do that? And I said, look, because I want to start the weekend with a clear desk. And he sort of said, well, how do you think it makes the producers feel to get a horrible email on a Friday? Shouldn't you think about them a little bit? So he said, why don't you just draft the emails? We'll send them on a Monday. And then I started to do that. So I do think one of the things that, again, as leaders, we have to think about how our actions affect others. So sometimes when you want to clear your inbox, because you're often pushing something, you know, along the chain somewhere, you have to go, okay, stop, I'll write it, but I won't send the email again until we're in ours.
Yeah. Really good advice. And those people who are bold enough to give those messages in our career are so helpful, aren't they? I can think of many in mine. Right, so we've got a lot of really interesting questions popping up here, so I'm just going to choose one at random, and we'll try to cover as many as we can, guys, but I'm sure we'll have lots. So first one from Penelope, who's asking, what's Ade's secret to keeping her passion fired up and forward facing?
Oh, you know what? It's really interesting, isn't it? Because you know what I think is that the thing that keeps me excited and keeping my passion fired, it's a really good question, is that I will always look at what others are doing and it will always inspire me. So I'll say, so Netflix at the moment, some of the stuff they do really inspires me. So I think, well, you know, what they are doing is something we should aspire to. So I think looking at what others are doing, not always in our sector, that always excites me. And there's always more to do. And it's not that I'm sort of more worried about what other people are doing than I'm doing. I just think that sometimes it just gives you a bit of a lift to see people doing things well. So I get very excited to see people and practitioners doing things well.
Brilliant. Thank you. And it's so nice. So I've got lots of fellows here asking questions who've been on the programmes I've been running. So lovely to see you all, guys. So Avatar is asking, what are the small actions you think we all, including emerging leaders, can do to be proactive in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think there were a few small actions. I think the first thing is that I think we all have a duty to educate ourselves. And I think that really, really matters. I think that we need to think to ourselves, how do we become more understanding of different groups in society that have less privilege than us? So I think we all have an obligation to do that. And I don't think it's good enough just to be able to say to your Black friend or your working class friend, what's your life like? I think you have to go and do a bit of the hard work yourself. So I think you have to do that. I think the other thing we have to do is we have to sort of challenge ourselves. And you know, I talked before about sort of particularly around bias. So we all of us have biases. You know, I really like sort of Black girls from Macclesfield because that's my background. So you know, so if I was going to interview a Black girl from Macclesfield, I would definitely be drawn to her. So what I would have to do to stop that happening is, I think you have to give yourself space and time so that you can separate yourself a little bit. If people are making quick decisions around hires or things like that, I think they generally give into their biases. If you give yourself a bit of time to separate yourself, you can say to yourself, why am I hiring this person? Am I hiring this person because they're the best person for the job? Or am I getting caught up in sort of things that make me feel good because they're like me? So I think you have to give yourself space in those decisions. And I think the third thing is that this is everyone's responsibility. So when we see other people being treated, you know, or whether it's discrimination in the workplace, whether it's an inappropriate joke, we all have the duty to call it out. And I think there's ways of calling it out that aren't really dramatic, where you can just say to the person afterwards, you can quietly take them to one side and say, you know what you said to X, actually, it might have been better if you framed it this way. And so I think those are the sort of things that we should be doing. So it's about education, it's about looking at our own actions, but it's also about what we can do to make more inclusive workforces and inclusive workplaces around the actions of others. So I think those are 3 things I would say.
Thank you, that's really beautifully clear. Question here from Shaq Skosh, who's Clore Social's Chief Executive. She's saying, you amazing woman, so interesting to hear you speak about the 1970s and how many of those issues are still live today. Why do you think our development and inclusion has been arrested? Black Lives Matters has given us such a new opportunity, and how do we make sure that we don't slide backwards again?
Yeah, and it's such a good question, because it does feel like we have this urgency, but I know that lots of people that have lived longer than me feel like, oh, we've been here before. And I think the reason I think it has been so slow to make progress is I think that we haven't been transparent enough. So I think that the first thing, I think we've always focused on the individual. So we've said, oh my goodness, there was an issue with progression of people of colour. So what they need is a scheme. So we've given them a scheme, but we haven't changed our organisations. So what's ended up happening is we've brought different people in, they've got to a certain level, felt quite frustrated, and then ended up exiting. And so we've got caught up in this sort of cycle of no one ever getting to positions of influence. So I think the first thing is we have never looked at the cultures of our organisations. So I think that's been a real barrier. And I think also we've sort of tinkered around the edges rather than addressing those structures. So that's the other challenge. And, you know, to have such a historical legacy is really, really hard. And, you know, as you said about the National Trust, I mean, these are the sort of things that we're dealing with, you know, in those sorts of places as well. And I think the thing that will stop us from sliding backwards this time is this sense of urgency, and also what I said before about the generational shift. I think the generation that are younger than us have led the charge when it's come to the environment, and I think they're leading the charge when it comes to equality. And so I think those young people will not want to live in a world that is unequal.
I think this next question, what you've just said, is maybe a nice springboard onto this next question from Pat Joseph, which is, what excites you most about your new position?
You know what, I mean, it's funny, because it's sort of what excites me about it. So what really excites me about it is the opportunity to be able to bring a subject like diversity, equality and inclusion to the top table. So that really, really excites me. The other thing that excites me about it is that because I'm now on the management board, I have a brief which is sort of slightly broader, and as well as doing my job, I am sort of responsible for helping to run the company. So I'm really enjoying being able to influence that. That really excites me. The other thing, but you know what really excites me about, the thing that I find most exciting about working at ITV is when we make good decisions about programming. So, you know, we've just commissioned a new series by a writer called Ade Rawcliffe, who'd gone off to America to work with Shonda Rhimes, and now has set this series, 6-part series in the world of black hair salons. So I'm really excited about that. So those sorts of things excite me, but, you know, I'm not always excited. Sometimes I feel really tired.
Yeah, there's a lot. I feel tired listening to you. I mean, there's so much. So we've got some other really interesting questions popping up. Anthony's asking, what are the greatest misconceptions and mistakes that you see across diversity and inclusion strategies? And I guess, does that link to any of that sense of exhaustion? You know what I've made all the mistakes, so I can tell you from my own personal career. So I would say that the single biggest one is setting unrealistic goals. When someone shows me a diversity inclusion strategy that has loads on it, my heart slightly sinks, because I think to myself, you are setting yourself too many things to do, and a lot of the things you're setting yourself to do, you won't know if you've done them or not.
So that's the thing. And, you know, mistakes that I've made is I have implemented things where I haven't started off with a measure. So I haven't known what success will look like. And I sometimes find, you know, something I have to fight within myself is impatience to get on with things, because my instinct is just to want to get on and do it. But I think that one of the things that I'm learning as I go on my own leadership journey is just stepping back from it and going, actually, what will success look like? It's almost like a sort of pre-mortem. So when we've done it, where will we want to be? And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes people make. And I think another mistake people make is they set a diversity strategy from the top, but then the middle managers can often kill it. So it's like, well, how's a strategy going to be implemented? And, you know, it happens all the time after we've talked about it, after the Black Lives Matter protests, all organizations came out with different diversity and inclusion strategies, of which we did too. And there was this whole sort of thing where people started to compete on what they'd announced. And everyone was sort of saying, oh, but is ours better than theirs? Is ours good enough? And I sort of said, look, stop. We're not going to be judged on our strategy. We're going to be judged on what we do, not on what we say we're going to do. And so I think that's another thing that people do. And another thing I would say is that I don't think it's wrong either to focus on a specific group. I don't think it's wrong to say, look, for a period of time, our diversity strategy is going to be about Black people, or our diversity strategy is going to be about disabled people. If you can point to data that shows that there's an underrepresentation of that group in your workforce, I don't think that on occasion, I don't think it's a problem to focus on something very specific. So you can say to yourself, did we hit that? Did we improve that?
And in choosing that specific focus area, how would you go about prioritizing?
Well, the way we have chosen our areas of focus is we've looked at the data, which is the makeup of our workforce, and we've looked for the groups that are most underrepresented, and we've targeted our strategy in the first year on those groups. And so at the end of the first group, we'll be able to measure how we have progressed in terms of recruitment, on screen, and retention, promotion, in terms of those groups. So that's how we've done it.
Great, thank you. And there are a couple of questions here about bias and unconscious bias. So there's one, I'll give you both at the same time. I think they're linked. So one is any advice about how to be aware and more mindful of our own bias. You mentioned, obviously we all have our biases. And then there's another one here about what your thoughts are about unconscious bias training. Does it have value, or is it just a panacea, and are there better ways?
So the first thing is, as I said to you earlier, to stop our own unconscious bias or conscious bias, whatever you want to call it, I think we just need to build time into our processes. So there's an opportunity for us to stop and look and think, oh, why are we making this decision? I mean, there was a great bit of analysis around appraisals of staff, and it said that when appraising men versus women and people of colour, that often we use different words for the same behaviour. So I think so here's a perfect example of how you can look at that. So if that's the case, if you are an appraising line manager, what you need to do is build time into your appraising. So we look at all your appraisals and you go, actually, have I described the woman differently to the man? Have I described the man differently to the person? So you just need to build in an extra layer of time to be able to do that. So I think those are things that can help you. But I think that when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're in a rush, it's when we make the worst decisions when it comes to unconscious bias. So in terms of unconscious bias training, I know it's sort of, I have been on unconscious bias training sessions where I've enjoyed them far too much, where it's just been a great day out. And so I think that is not great when you sort of come out of it and go, well, I've done the session now, back to normal. But what I would say about unconscious bias training is the one advantage of it is that I think that lots of people are in different places on this journey. And the one thing that's good about it is that it's route 101, it's an entry point. But what I would say is that it's not a panacea by itself. So you can't just go, we've put the whole business through unconscious bias training, and then that's it. You then have to keep refreshing it, having discussions after it, looking at how you appraise people, looking at how you promote people. So it has to sort of be backed by sort of data. It can't just be unconscious bias training by itself. We're doing something internally at the moment, which is quite interesting. We're doing a thing called race fluency training. And we're finding that really useful as a way of having discussions around race. It's about encouraging people to talk about race, talk about their experiences, but also helping people who feel less comfortable around vocabulary around race.
Thanks, Thank you. And there's another linked question here about qualifications, and for people who are looking to focus more time and energy in diversity and inclusion. Did you take any qualifications yourself, and would you advise anybody to pursue any of those?
So this is now where I'm going to feel like a complete fraud, because when I sort of started doing my job, I'd come from TV production, and I went to a sort of diversity and inclusion job at Channel 4, and I sort of thought to myself, I'll do this for a couple of years, I'll sort it all out, and then I'll go back to making programs. I'm still waiting to sort it all out so I can go back to making programs. So I have no formal qualifications. Obviously, I've got a degree, but I have no formal qualification in diversity and inclusion. And I guess the bit that I find really useful for my work is other people's research. So I do think there's been some great sort of research around, you know, McKinsey have done some good research. So I find other people's research really, really useful in helping to illustrate various different, the impacts of various different things that we try to do. So the other question is, would I suggest a qualification? I don't know, because the answer to that is that it depends what sort of person you are. Some people really like qualifications and enjoy that process. So I think if you do, why not? But most of the people that I work with do not have formal diversity inclusion qualifications, but some people have sort of HR, CIPD qualifications.
Thank you. And I'm trying my best to scan all of these amazing questions and try and link them together. So there's one here which is about, on a kind of similar theme, around how you manage that transition from production into diversity and inclusion. This person, Martin Sigsworth, says, having worked in TV previously, it feels like a different skill set might be required between those roles, which feel a bit overwhelming. And any thoughts you have around that?
Well, it's a really, really good question, isn't it? Because I went from making TV programs to, first of all, working in diversity and inclusion in sort of quite talent-based. So it's about who was on screen, who was making what was on screen at Channel 4. And I spent sort of 10 years working at Channel 4 doing various things, but it was all very much around television. And I think the fact that I had been a practitioner in the industry really helped me, because people thought I knew what I was talking about, because I understood the processes. But I guess the question now is whether I would feel that I could use my experience in television to transfer to another space working in diversity and inclusion. Because if you look at my CV, I've spent all my diversity and inclusion work working in the creative industry, or working specifically in television. So I feel very comfortable that I have the right skill set to work in television at a diversity and inclusion level, but it is a different skill set. But would I feel comfortable going to do it for another business? I mean, that's a question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would definitely, there are definitely things that we've done at ITV and Channel 4 that would be transferable. But one of the things that I feel very comfortable about in the role that I do is I know the business really well, because I've spent my whole life working in this business. So I know everybody, I know how it works, I know the process. And if I didn't have that, I think it might be harder for me to implement effective policies.
And that's making me think, sorry, this is selfishly my own question, that's making me think about all the many board roles that you have, which are obviously outside of that creative space. And are you specifically playing a diversity and inclusion role there, or is that?
I mean, I think that when you are a Black woman working in diversity, you're asked to go for a board role. I think that's absolutely the role that you're playing. And I think you're bringing that sort of expertise to the table. But I also think you're bringing your experience. And I sort of sometimes sit around, you know, the board positions that aren't particularly linked to television. And I feel very much responsible as a Black woman for how I respond to issues, because I think it's really important that when you make an effort to have diversity of thought around a board table, I have to show up and be that diversity of thought.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions here on kind of organisational culture and change, and really getting that embedded institutional change that you've talked about. So there's one question here from Srita Allen. What advice would you give on creating lasting cultural change within organisations?
Yeah, I think if you want to build lasting cultural change within organisations, you have to change your processes. You have to embed it into your processes. So the example that I used earlier was about the commissioning process. So in order we commission programs from producers, and as part of that process now, we've now embedded diversity and inclusion. So every program commissioned has to make a commitment around what they're going to do on screen, what they're going to do off screen, and we sort of monitor that. So that's just become business as usual. And we're now sort of moving that out to look at how we procure other services. So when we have a contract with Vodafone, what are they going to be doing around it? So I think you have to build it into your processes so that if I drop dead tomorrow, it would all continue. And because that's the legacy, isn't it? Is if we weren't there, then it would continue. So I think that is really important. I also think that you have to, in terms of your culture, there are really big things that you look at, like you look at the data where you say, look, we can see the makeup of so we sort of report annually and externally on the makeup of our whole staff, then of our sort of senior leadership team, which is our top sort of 100 or so, and then our executive leadership. So we sort of break it all down. But I also think more importantly than that, in terms of an inclusive culture, is there's all that hard stuff in the data that I would want to see, representing a nation. But I would also want people to feel that they are equally included in our workplace culture. So people from different backgrounds would feel that they had equal opportunity and were equally listened to and all those sorts of things. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're there at all. I think we've got a lot of work to do with that. And one of the schemes that we're doing at the moment is around, it's a sort of leadership scheme for people of colour, and it's about how to get more people to senior leadership positions. And it was back to the point I made before about not trying to fix the person. What we've done is we've tried, and we've never done this before, so I'll have to come back and tell you if it works, but what we've done is we've also put the line manager through the process, because the line manager is about creating that inclusive culture. Mm-hmm. So I think those sorts of things, as well as it's not just about the individual, it's about what levers do you have to pull to make your culture more inclusive.
We'd love to have you back to hear how that's gone. One of those real practical things someone's asking about is about recruitment, and how, so a question from Sylvia about how you distribute and advertise roles so that they reach a more diverse audience in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, we now, all our permanent jobs are advertised. So there's none of those sort of, knocking people on the shoulder or anything like that. So all our permanent jobs now go through a proper process. Scheme at Channel 4, and we had a real challenge with getting black boys to apply. And I remember going to speak to various different youth groups to say, why aren't these boys applying? We put the ad in the Guardian, why aren't they applying? And sort of, not reading the Guardian. And so I do think you have to start to form relationships with communities and areas that you have a relationship with them before your jobs come, so that when your jobs do come, they know your organisation and think you mean them and all that sort of stuff. So I do think that your outreach programme, in terms of how you build links with people before you need to advertise a job, is really, really important.
Thank you. And there's a question from Jenny who's asking, linked to that, where would you recommend placing recruitment adverts? We all laughed when you said the Guardian.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we use. I think we use the diversity job site. We use that. So that's an area that we use. I mean, where we also use, well, I mean, it's an obvious one, but we get a lot of diverse applicants from using LinkedIn. So we get a wide range of people that come from LinkedIn. So those are sort of the main places that we use. But for ITV, it's sort of slightly different thing, because what we've tried really hard to do is build relationships with different communities so that they have an ongoing relationship with us, so that they think to look on our job pages. And we spent a long time doing that over the last two or 3 years. And so we're finding that we're getting a really diverse range of candidates for all the jobs that we advertise. But the challenge still is the application to hire.
Yeah.
So we still haven't got that right. So that's what we're working on.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sure there's lots of people scribbling down lots of notes as you're saying these things. Question here from Nikki Jeffrey. Hi, Nikki. What approaches have you used to build that sense of shared responsibility you spoke about, and accountability around diversity and inclusion with other staff and the board at ITV, recognising embedding practices still requires a change initially that people need to make time to get used to and to do?
Well, so our board, so with our PLC board, we are, as I said earlier, we've put all our staff through race fluency training. We are going to put our board through it. So our board are going to do that collectively. And that was really important because they needed to be aligned with our vision at ITV. And also we've sort of, for the first time in our annual report this year, we're going to publish the makeup of our board, because I think it's really important that we're accountable to what our board looks like, and it's reflective of our viewers and society more widely. And then back to embedding it. So we've sort of done sort of training, inclusive leader training, inclusive manager training, race fluency training for all staff. So we've done that. But I think that in terms of making it absolutely part of people's job, I talked about the commissioning process. We've embedded it into the commissioning process. We have people who are on a performance-related pay plan have diversity and inclusion as an objective. So that is one of the things that we are judged on in terms of our performance. So we're judged on whether advertising revenue is a certain level, we're judged on viewing figures, and another one of those baskets of messages is what you personally have done to help ITV deliver its diversity and inclusion strategy. So we announced our diversity acceleration plan. It has 5 clear prongs, which we're going to be measured on and we're going to report on annually. And it's about how staff have contributed to that.
Thank you. And you've talked a few times about measures of success and knowing what good looks like and what you're actually trying to achieve being the much more important thing than actually the inputs at the beginning. How do you go about evaluating the impact of the work you're leading on? Question from Sweeta Allen. I can't take credit for that. So.
There's sort of, so we have a few ways we measure it. So the first thing is that we have set out a 5-point diversity acceleration plan, which we've publicly announced, which is around sort of all the levels of ITV about what impact we can have. And we will have tangible measures to be able to say, did you do that? So we said we're going to increase the amount of people of colour presenters in our lead TV shows, so we'll be able to see that. We said we're going to go from 20 to 60 apprenticeships this year, so you'll be able to see that. So there was the hard numbers around that sort of stuff, so we're very clear on that. We've set ourselves targets around workforce, and we've set ourselves a target for 2022, and so you can see those sort of workplace targets. But the thing that I'm really interested in all that sort of stuff, so it really matters, those hard measures as well. But what you wouldn't want is you to have achieved all those things, but people in your organisation say, well, for me, nothing's changed. So that's the sort of worry, isn't it? That you do all that sort of stuff, but if you haven't absolutely intersected with those things, you think, oh, for me, this hasn't changed. And that's why it's important that we get buy-in for everybody. And what's really helped us is we have some brilliant staff networks that have been really helpful at helping to build the inclusive culture. And they're really great sounding boards in terms of giving feedback to what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. So they're brilliant. But also what we're going to do for the first time this year is, as part of our staff engagement study, a survey that we do every year, we're going to sort of put inclusion questions in there so we can see whether people are feeling more included about the business. You know, we ask people about whether they like working from home and all those sorts of things. So it's just how you get the temperature of everyone in the organisation, and you can measure whether that's improving or not.
And is that the first time that you will have done that?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, how exciting.
Yeah.
Great.
So we're going to do that.
And you mentioned the plan with the hard targets in them. Is that something that we could read?
Yeah, that's our diversity acceleration plan. We said that we were going to improve diversity at senior level. The role that I now do. We talked about, you know, improving representation within our commissioning editors, our sort of senior editorial leaders. So that's all very public. We talked about, we did some brilliant research, which I talked about before, the seen on screen research, which highlighted how sophisticated our viewers are in terms of understanding. And the big thing they said is, look, we don't want to see people of colour as the best friend. We want to see them as the main character. So we've done a lot of work on sort of main characters and lead presenters. And again, we'll be able to, we've measured, we've got data to show that the improvement there. Then we talked about sort of using positive action to increase the amount of people coming into ITV. So we've increased our apprenticeship scheme from 20 to 60, which is particularly important this year, given the horrific time young people are having with opportunities. But it's been quite challenging because working from home when you're a young person is really hard, because often you're not set up to work from home, but also the way you learn is being surrounded by other people. And interestingly, there are lots of great things about working from home, and lots of things that in terms of inclusion work really well for people who have caring responsibilities, for disabled people, for people that want to be at home more. There are lots of things like that that work quite well. But what we're finding is our younger staff are less keen, because they are worried that it's going to impact their career progression, because they don't get enough time with the boss. And also they want to be with other people in the office. So it's quite interesting how you juggle that, because some people are very happy to stay at home, and other people, you know, so that's the next sort of challenge for us. And then the fourth thing has been around 1, 2, 3. Oh yes, we've launched a scheme called Step Up 60, which is about trying to get more people into sort of more senior editorial roles within ITV programs. Because what we found is people coming in on training schemes and they were getting to a certain level, then they were getting stuck. So it's like, how do we get more directors? How do we get more writers? How do we get more producers? So what we've done is on our returning shows, we've created opportunities for people to step up to get their first primetime director credits, and we're going to do 60 of those. And then the final thing was very much around education. We've all got to educate ourselves. Everybody at ITV has to educate themselves, and so we committed to going on a journey to educate ourselves around racism and, you know, what it meant to work in an organisation and all those sorts of things.
Fantastic. I'm certainly going to go and have a read of that. So thank you. Lots of the things that you've said, I'm sure, will resonate with lots of people who are working in larger organisations with some of those infrastructure around them. I just wondered if you've got any thoughts about, if you're coming from a really, really small organisation, is there any different actions that you might suggest?
Really good question, isn't it? Because I realise that I have the advantage of only having worked in sort of bigger organisations, because I was at Channel 4 and now I'm at ITV. So I can understand that a lot of things might feel like very big, expensive things to do. Can do is think about their own talent pipeline. So how do you, if you are a small organisation and you don't feel you're representative but don't have lots of jobs coming up, how can you think longer term so you start to build a talent pipeline so that when a job does come up, you have lots of people that might be ready to go? So I think that's one thing. And I also think that you know, you can always give opportunities to people through sort of mentoring, through giving people paid work placements. There are always sort of smaller things that people can do to increase representation in their organisation and allow for different voices to come through.
Thank you. And this question was a while ago, so apologies, Rachel, I didn't spot it at the time. You mentioned race fluidity training or race fluency training. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, actually. So I actually did it myself and I learned lots, actually. It was really, really interesting. It's basically about people feeling comfortable acknowledging race and talking about race. And it's interesting, there was a brilliant study that this is what they talk about in the first bit of the training, where you play Guess Who, you sort of play virtual Guess Who. And often what you find with white people is that they don't feel comfortable describing the colour of the Guess Who character. So it's the most obvious thing, but so they'll say big nose, glasses, and often a lot of the time, the last thing they'll say is the colour of their skin. And so it's just sort of trying to sort of unpack and have those discussions with people. And I think that what the training does is it doesn't make you think, you know what, I've got the guidebook now, I know exactly how to talk about everybody, but I think it makes you feel comfortable having those discussions with people, but also feeling like if you don't feel happy with how someone's described you, saying, actually, I prefer if you said this about me. So it's just trying, I guess what we're trying to create is some sort of psychological safety around race. That's what we're trying to create. But I've been really struck. It's been really well received, because, you know, you try these things and we met the providers and they're brilliant, but you never quite know how these things will land until you do them. But I've been really pleasantly surprised by how engaged the business has been around it. So it seems to have worked really well.
Brilliant, well done, thank you. That's so interesting. I'm going to play Guess Who with my children this afternoon and see what happens.
Yeah.
A question from Maya or Mia. How have you built out organisational-wide support to this issue to develop future leaders and future champions who will continue this fantastic work?
That's a really, really good question. I think that I've benefited from great leadership from the top. So our chairman is very supportive, and our CEO is really, really supportive. So that has allowed me to sort of build out a network of people that we are genuinely really committed to the agenda. But in terms of the next generation, what the best way I've started to see sort of next generation voices come through has been through our networks. So I was really struck when we, last year after Black Lives Matter protests, I was really struck with the confidence that some of our younger staff had to be able to tell us when they thought we weren't doing it correctly. And that was done through our network. So we've got, and there's a great author who does this sort of whole book about the power of staff networks. And what we've actually managed to do through our staff networks is actually build some people who have become more taking on a leadership role, because now they're sort of convening meetings with the CEO and all these sorts of things. So they have become sort of future leaders through their work with our various networks. We've got ABLE, which is our disability network. We've got our people of colour network, which is Embrace. We've got a women's network. We've got a carers network called Balance. And I think that's it, isn't it? And then we've got Pride. We've got obviously got an LGBT plus LGBT plus network. Yeah. So that's one way where we've been able to build leadership.
Great. And you mentioned a book. I don't think what was the
it's called I can't remember who it's written by now, but it's called The Power of Staff Networks, and it talks about how in America, there's a brilliant woman that talks about this, her name has just left my head, but it's just about how in America running a staff network or being involved in a staff network really helps you to build your brand and build your profile. And what we've tried to do is enable that to happen within our network. You know, we're on a journey. One thing I don't want to leave you with is this idea that I've got all the answers. We're on a journey like all organizations. But that's one thing that we've been trying to instill in people, that they, you know, have a leadership position now because of their work with the network. They can speak truth to the CEO. They can come and tell us when we're not doing things right. And I think it's really important, because one thing I don't want to be is I don't want to be sort of CEO of blackness. I mean, you know, there's got to be lots of people that also have other people, other points of view. Obviously, when we talk about diversity, we're talking about all the different groups. So I do think you need to be able to have many voices who get to have their opinion on what we're doing and what we should be doing better. It's not just my voice, and I'm really aware that I'm aware that I'm there to represent many others. It's not really just about me.
And I think you've probably answered the question that Jen has just posted, but she's asking what sort of role do these groups and networks play within the organisation? Would you add anything?
Yeah, so I would say that they play a social role. We've seen network growth within our organisation grow sort of like 300%, because I think that one of the things that people are really missing working like this is casual conversation. All our conversations now are very high powered, we're on and all that sort of stuff. There's none of the what did you watch last night on TV. So our networks form a social function. So they definitely form a social function, but they also, some more than others, sort of form a sort of strategic role, in the sense that they will feed back to us on things that are happening in the business. And when we came up with our diversity acceleration plan, we consulted them. So I guess it's social role. I think they are really helpful in helping us to implement our diversity acceleration plan. And I also think they can support some of our strategic activity. So I think those are three roles for our networks.
Brilliant, thank you. And Nadia, my glamorous assistant, has been posting some of the suggestions you've been making in the chat. So the author of that book is Cheron Inko Taraya. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. So that's there. There's also a question from Brianne, who's asking about going back to the race fluency training. If you could tell us who the provider is, because it sounds really
Delta.
Yeah. I'm sure they will appreciate the plug.
Yeah, exactly. They'll appreciate the plug. And if you don't find them, I can send the details to Emily and she can circulate them, or Nadia.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The question here, we've only got time for a couple more. So there's a question, really important question, I think, about how you've managed any pushback or challenge this agenda from senior people within the organisation. You've talked about having a huge amount of support, but how do you manage when that isn't there?
Yeah, you know what, this is, so I would say that managing pushback, we have to accept that not everybody's on the same page as us. So not everybody's on the same journey. I mean, I can give so many living examples. So so I'm going to give you two examples. The first example is that we did a campaign last year called Black Voices. And Black Voices was a campaign where high-profile Black celebrities, and politicians, David Lammy did one, will.i.am did one, talked about the effect racism had on their life and the change they would like to see. And it was quite an unusual thing for ITV to do it, but we were really proud of it. And because we put them up on social media, we got massive pushback. So some people were saying it's outrageous that people are talking about racism. Racism doesn't exist in society. And some of the tweets were quite personal, the usual sort of stuff. Because we have to also acknowledge we're in a contested space with some of this stuff as well. And so then there was a slight feeling within the organisation where some people were saying, this illustrates that we've gone too far. We're stepping out of what we should be at ITV. And I had to be really quite forceful and say, look, I really disagree with you. I think this illustrates that we haven't gone far enough, quick enough, that our viewers are still in this space. But one thing, so I was sort of able to sort of push back quite resistantly with that, and maybe able to get allyship from other people in the business that could help me push that through. But I think I made a mistake, because I think that one thing I hadn't realized is that at a time when people are working from there were some people on the viewer inquiries line and who have to read all this awful racist abuse. So they were getting a lot of that. And so I think if I had my time again, we would have had more support. And now going forward, we would have more support for people having to deal with that. And another example of this is that when people push back, I think it's really important for you to say to people, look, why are you pushing back? What is it you have a problem with, and really have a honest conversation with them. So when I was at Channel 4, I first introduced the sort of commissioning diversity guidelines, and a lot of the commissioning editors were sort of saying, oh, that'll never work because of this, that will never work because of this. And I sort of said, well, let's do it like this. We'll launch them, but every problem you've got, if you send it to me, I'll make a note of them, and then when we redo them a year later, I'll incorporate all your points. So I've got all these, loads of things that were going to be terrible with them, loads of things that weren't going to work. And then we did it for a year. And I went back and saw one of those commissioning editors and said, look, this thing that you said wasn't going to happen, and the thing you wanted changed, do you still want it changed? Because if you do want it changed, I will change it for you. And they said, I never said that. I would never said that. I've not complained about it. So actually what tends to happen is people are resistant to change, but they adapt to it more quickly than you imagine once they know they haven't got a choice and you've built it into their job.
And more quickly than they imagine as well.
But I do,
by the sounds of it.
Yes, but I do think you've got to listen to people. I do think people need to feel listened to, and sometimes you don't want to have to listen to them. I do think you have to listen to people who are challenging what you're doing.
And this is the last question, which I think is just the follow-up really from Pat. She says, you're such an amazing woman, so committed and inspirational. As a Black woman, how would you encourage organisations that it's worth the risk to employ people who are very likely to challenge their status quo?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really brilliant question to end on. And I do think that gosh, a really good question. I mean, I think that organisations are more likely to take on people who will challenge their status quo when they feel confident in themselves. So I think actually organisations that resist that, it reveals more about them, because I think it means that they don't have, are not confident in themselves. So I think that what we have to do is we have to illustrate to organisations the power of diversity of thought, the power that different voices can bring to your organization. And you can see it all the time. I mean, even in our organization, I can see what having different voices brings to our organization. So I think in creative organizations, we have to encourage them to do that. But I think another thing, back to my earlier point about Netflix, is that looking at other companies that are doing it successfully and encouraging other companies to be role modeled by them is really important as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Gosh, that went so quickly. I feel like I could have this conversation for another 3 hours. There's so much that we could still hear from. But thank you so very much for your time and for all your wise words and suggestions. Nadia's put all those links in the chat. Thank you so much. And thank you also for everyone for coming and for your interesting and stimulating discussions. Watch this space. We try to have Leaders Now sessions about once a month. And if you want to carry on some of these discussions, then do sign up to Shared Purpose, which is Clore Social's pretty new interactive community space. So if you haven't signed up for that, then please do so. Lots of thank yous popping up on the chat. So huge thank you, everyone. Found that really, really inspiring. Have a good rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you for having me.